At 21, Zoe was abandoned by her family with nothing but her rusty sedan and a few crumpled bills. Desperate for shelter from the freezing rain, she bought a rotting $10 sugar shack at a farm auction. What she found, welded inside its rusted boiling pan, didn't just buy her a mansion, it exposed a decades-old crime. The heavy oak door of the Burlington, Vermont Colonial slammed shut with a finality that made Zoe Alexandra flinch. It was October 14th, her 21st birthday. Instead of a cake or a celebration, she was standing on a wet porch in a freezing downpour, staring at 3 black garbage bags containing everything she owned. On the other side of the door was Kevin Lawson, her controlling, affluent stepfather, who had been looking for an excuse to kick her out since the day he married her mother, Brenda. She had stood quietly in the kitchen, staring at the granite countertops, refusing to meet Zoe's eyes, as Kevin handed down his ultimatum. "You're an adult now. You're out of my house. Today." Zoe dragged the heavy bags down the driveway to her 2004 Ford Taurus. The car had a cracked windshield, a failing transmission, and a heater that only blew cold air. Sitting in the driver's seat, soaked to the bone, she pulled out her phone and checked her banking app. Available balance $842.16. That was it. That was her safety net. It wasn't enough for first and last month's rent anywhere in Chittenden County, let alone a security deposit. She spent her first 3 nights as an adult, sleeping in the back seat of her Taurus in a 24-hour grocery store parking lot, wearing 3 layers of clothes to stave off the biting New England autumn chill. By the 4th day, desperation set in. She needed a plan, and more importantly, she needed a roof. Searching local classifieds on her phone from a coffee shop, an advertisement caught her eye. County estate auction. Foreclosed farm and scrap. It was happening out in Hardwick, about an hour away. The ad mentioned farm equipment, outbuildings, and scrap materials going to the highest bidder. Zoe thought maybe she could buy a cheap, insulated hunting blind, or a sturdy shed to sleep in temporarily, while she figured out her life. When she arrived at the overgrown property, formerly owned by an old recluse named Arthur Higgins, the rain was coming down in sheets. A crowd of local farmers and scrap metal dealers stood huddled under a massive white tent as the auctioneer, a booming man named Dale, rattled off bids for tractors, antique tools, and rusty trucks. Zoe waited for hours, shivering in her damp jacket, watching items go for thousands of dollars. Her heart sank. She was entirely out of her depth. Then, as the auction dwindled and the crowd thinned, Dale pointed to a miserable, dilapidated structure sitting deep in the mud at the edge of the tree line. "All right, folks, lot 77. Dale announced, his voice raspy from hours of yelling. "We have a portable maple sugar shack on steel skids. Wood's rotting roof's rusted, and it's full of junk. Must be moved off the property by the buyer by tomorrow noon. Do I hear $50? Silence. The remaining men laughed. The shack was roughly 10 by 12 feet. Its cedar siding was grey and splintering, and the corrugated tin roof was practically entirely rust. $20, Dale pleaded. "Come on, boys, the steel skids under it are worth that in scrap." More silence. Dale sighed. $10. Someone give me a $10 bill just so I don't have to pay the county to haul it to the dump. Zoe's heart pounded against her ribs. $10. It was a wooden box with a roof. It was terrible, it was rotting, but it wasn't the back seat of a Ford Taurus. Her hand shot up into the cold air. "Sold to the young lady in the back for $10. Dale slammed his gavel. A few of the men gave her pitying looks, but Zoe didn't care. She marched up to the clerk's table, handed over a crisp $10 bill from her meager stash, and received a crudely scribbled bill of sale. Now came the real problem, moving it. She walked over to a burly man who had just bought a flatbed trailer. His name was Tommy, a local tow truck operator. After 30 minutes of pleading and offering him $200, a massive chunk of her remaining funds, Tommy agreed to drag the shack onto his flatbed and haul it to a cheap $15 a night gravel RV lot Zoe had found online, run by a grumpy but sympathetic manager named Gary. By nightfall, the $10 sugar shack was dropped unceremoniously onto Lot 14 of the Pine Creek RV Park. It looked like a haunted outhouse sitting between gleaming fifth-wheel campers. Gary walked over, a flashlight in hand, shining it on the rotting wood. "You're actually going to sleep in there, kid?" Gary asked, his eyebrows raised in disbelief. "It's temporary." Zoe lied, her teeth chattering. "Just until I get on my feet." "Well," Gary sighed, handing her a heavy-duty tarp. "Throw this over the roof. Looks like it's going to rain again. And don't plug anything crazy into the site's outlet. That shack looks like it'd go up like a matchstick." As Gary walked away, Zoe pulled open the creaking, warped wooden door of her new home. She clicked on her phone's flashlight, stepping inside. The smell hit her instantly, a thick, suffocating odor of mildew, wet earth, and the faint, sweet ghost of decades-old maple syrup. It was packed with debris. Broken glass dead, leaves a collapsed workbench, and rusted metal pipes littered the floor. But taking up almost half the space in the center of the room was a massive, terrifyingly heavy object. It was an industrial-sized cast-iron evaporator pan used for boiling maple sap into syrup. Zoe slumped against the damp wall, sliding down to the dirty floorboards. She pulled her knees to her chest in the dark, the reality of her situation crushing her. She was 21, completely alone, and sitting in a $10 pile of garbage. She buried her face in her hands, and for the first time since her stepfather kicked her out, she finally wept. The next morning, sunlight sliced through the cracks in the shack's rotting walls, waking Zoe from a fitful sleep on an old yoga mat. Her body ached, but the panic of the previous night had settled into a cold, hard resolve. She had to make this space livable. She spent the entire morning hauling debris out of the shack. She cleared out shattered mason jars, piles of decaying newspapers dating back to 1988, and rusted hand tools. But no matter how much she cleaned, the room was still dominated by the monstrous cast-iron evaporator pan sitting in the center. It was roughly 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, and a foot deep. "All right, you have to go," Zoe muttered to herself, stretching her back. She walked over to the pan, grabbed the rusted handles on one side, planted her feet, and pulled with all her might. It didn't move a single millimeter. Zoe frowned. Cast iron was heavy, sure, but she should have been able to slide it across the wooden floorboards. She crouched down, wiping away decades of dust, cobwebs, and grime from the surface of the pan. As the dirt cleared, she noticed something incredibly strange. A standard evaporator pan is an open basin. But this one wasn't open. Someone had taken a thick plate of 1/4-inch steel, laid it directly over the top of the basin, and meticulously welded it shut. A continuous heavy bead of industrial weld ran along the entire perimeter, sealing the basin completely. Zoe traced the rough, oxidized metal with her fingertips. Why would a poor, reclusive farmer spend hours permanently welding a heavy steel plate over a maple sap pan? It rendered the equipment completely useless. She grabbed an old crowbar she had found in the debris and wedged it under the lip of the steel plate, pushing down with all her weight. The crowbar bent, but the weld held firm. She tapped the top of the steel plate with the heavy end of the bar. Thud, thud. It didn't ring hollow. It sounded dense, packed. Curiosity overrode her exhaustion. Zoe drove her limping Taurus to a nearby hardware store. She browsed the aisles, agonizing over the prices, before finally spending $45 on a cheap angle grinder, a pack of metal-cutting discs, and a pair of safety goggles. Her bank account was draining fast, but an inexplicable gut feeling told her she needed to know what was inside that pan. Back in the dim light of the shack, she plugged an extension cord into the RV park's utility pole, snapped on the safety goggles, and gripped the grinder. When the spinning abrasive disc hit the rusted weld, a brilliant shower of orange sparks illuminated the gloomy shack. The screech of metal on metal was deafening. The smell of ozone and burning rust filled the tight space, forcing Zoe to tie a bandana around her face to breathe. It was grueling work. The steel was thick, and whoever had sealed it had wanted to make absolutely sure it never opened again. After 45 minutes, her arms were trembling, her hands were numb from the vibration, and she had burned through 3 cutting wheels. Just one more side, she told herself, gritting her teeth. As she cut through the final corner, there was a sudden, sharp hiss. It was the sound of a vacuum seal, breaking, releasing trapped stale air that had been locked away for decades. Zoe killed the power to the grinder. The silence in the shack was sudden and heavy. Using the crowbar, she wedged the tip into the freshly cut seam. With a massive heave, the heavy steel plate creaked, lifted and flipped backward, slamming onto the floorboards with a thunderous crash. Zoe coughed, waving away the cloud of rusty dust that plumed into the air. She stepped forward and looked down into the rusted iron belly of the pan. Her breath caught in her throat. The pan wasn't filled with dirt rocks or scrap. It was packed to the brim with heavy, thick bundles wrapped tightly in military-grade oilcloth and sealed with layers of degraded duct tape. Tucked into the corners were dozens of large silica gel packets, clearly placed there to absorb moisture and preserve whatever was hidden inside. Her hands shook as she reached in and pulled out the first bundle. It was about the size of a shoebox, and surprisingly heavy. She set it on the floor, grabbed a utility knife, and carefully sliced through the ancient oilcloth. Rip. As the fabric peeled back, Zoe gasped, stumbling backward until she hit the wall of the shack. Inside the bundle were stacks of money, but they weren't modern bills. They were stacks of immaculate, uncirculated $100 bills. She picked up a stack, her thumb trembling as she flipped through them. The paper felt crisp, practically brand new. She looked closely at the dates. Every single bill was stamped, Series 1981. "Oh my God," she whispered into the empty room. There were at least a dozen similar bundles still sitting inside the pan. If they were all filled with cash, there were hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in front of her. But as she reached into the pan to pull out a second bundle, her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic near the bottom. She moved a few of the cash bundles aside, revealing a heavy fireproof lockbox. Zoe lifted the box out. It wasn't locked. The latch was simply rusted shut. She pried it open with her utility knife. Inside there was no money. Instead, there was a thick, leather-bound ledger, a collection of Polaroid photographs, and a stack of official-looking documents wrapped in clear plastic. She pulled out the ledger and opened it to the first page. It was filled with meticulously handwritten columns of names, dates, and massive dollar amounts. But it was the name written boldly inside the front cover that made her blood run cold. Property of Marcus Thorne, 1983. Wait. Zoe thought, staring at the name. I know that name. Everybody in Burlington knew that name. Marcus Thorne wasn't just anybody. He was a prominent local bank executive who had vanished without a trace in the winter of 1984, taking nearly $3 million in embezzled client funds with him. The police had assumed he fled the country. It was the biggest unsolved mystery in the state's history. And yet here was his personal ledger, sitting alongside a fortune in stolen cash, sealed inside a rusty sap pan on an abandoned farm owned by a reclusive nobody. Zoe's hands trembled violently as she realized the gravity of her discovery. She hadn't just found a hidden treasure. She had just unearthed the burial vault of a 40-year-old criminal conspiracy, and whoever had sealed this pan was either dead or they were eventually coming back for it. The revelation sent a violent shiver down Zoe's spine. She sat on the cold, splintered floorboards, her breathing shallow and fast, surrounded by a small mountain of 19 $8,100 bills. But it wasn't the money holding her attention anymore. It was the stack of aging Polaroids. With trembling fingers, she picked up a photograph that had slipped from the center of the leather-bound ledger. The image was slightly faded, its colors washed out by time, but the faces were unmistakable. Two men stood in front of this very sugar shack, leaning against a vintage pickup truck. One was a scruffy older man in overalls, likely Arthur Higgins, the reclusive farmer who had owned the property. The other man was younger, wearing a sharp, tailored suit that looked entirely out of place on a muddy Vermont farm. He had a smug, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. Zoe's stomach plummeted. She knew that smirk. She had lived under its oppressive shadow for the last 7 years. It was Kevin Lawson, her stepfather. "No," Zoe whispered, flipping the photo over. Scrawled on the back in faded blue ink were 4 words, Arthur and Kevin. The partnership. Frantically, Zoe began tearing through the official documents wrapped in plastic. There were property deeds, bank transfer slips, and a series of notarized contracts. As she read through the dense legalese, the dark, twisted history of her stepfather's wealth began to crystallize. Kevin Lawson hadn't built his real estate empire from scratch. In the early 1980s, he had been a junior loan officer, working directly under the missing bank executive. According to the meticulous notes in the ledger, it wasn't the executive who had orchestrated the massive embezzlement of $3 million. It was Kevin. The executive had discovered the theft, and Kevin, along with Arthur Higgins, had framed him, silenced him, and buried the evidence. Arthur's role was to hide the physical cash on his remote farm until the heat died down. But Arthur, perhaps paranoid or stricken by a guilty conscience, had welded the money shut inside the heavy iron evaporator pan, essentially locking Kevin out of his own stolen fortune. When Arthur died, suddenly the secret of the exact location died with him. A sickening realization washed over her. October 14th, her birthday, the day Kevin had kicked her out of the house. He hadn't just kicked her out because she turned 21. He kicked her out because the county had finally foreclosed on Arthur Higgins's abandoned estate that very week. Kevin had likely been quietly trying to buy the property back through shell companies for years, but failed. With the public auction underway, he was likely panicking, clearing his house of any distractions, including his stepdaughter, so he could focus on retrieving the hidden vault before the land was cleared. He just didn't know the vault was inside a $10 pile of rotting cedar. And he certainly didn't know Zoe had bought it. Suddenly, the crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway shattered the quiet of the RV park. Zoe froze. The shack was pitch black, save for the faint moonlight bleeding through the rusted tin roof. She heard the low, aggressive hum of an expensive engine idling just a few yards away. Then the slam of a heavy car door. "Hey, you can't just drive back here. Private property." It was Gary, the RV park manager, his voice tinged with sleepy annoyance. "I'm looking for a rusted sugar shack," a deep, smooth voice replied. "Brought in yesterday by a tow truck." "Where is it?" Zoe clapped a hand over her mouth. It was Kevin. "I don't know what you're talking about, buddy," Gary said, stepping in front of the headlights. "You need to leave before I call the cops. I'll give you $1,000 to point to it, or I'll walk right through you and find it myself." Kevin threatened, his tone dripping with venom. Panic seized Zoe's chest. She had minutes, maybe seconds. She grabbed her waterproof canvas backpack from the floor. She couldn't take all the money, there were simply too many bundles, and they were too heavy. She frantically stuffed the ledger, the plastic-wrapped documents, the Polaroids, and 6 bundles of the 1981 cash into the bag, zipping it shut. Crunch, crunch. Heavy footsteps were marching down the gravel path, scanning the lots with a high-powered beam of light. Zoe scrambled toward the back of the shack. The wooden planks were severely rotted. She kicked at the bottom boards with her heavy boots, once, twice. The damp cedar splintered and gave way, creating a jagged hole just big enough for her to squeeze through. A blinding white light hit the front of the shack, peering through the cracks in the door. "Well, well, look at this piece of trash," Kevin muttered outside. Zoe squeezed through the hole in the back, her jacket snagging on a rusty nail. She pulled hard, tearing the fabric, and tumbled out into the muddy grass behind the lot, completely hidden by the shadows of the dense pine trees. Crash. The front door of the shack was kicked open. From her hiding spot in the brush, Zoe heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by a primal, enraged scream that echoed into the night. Kevin had seen the severed weld. He knew someone had beaten him to it. Clutching the heavy backpack to her chest, Zoe didn't wait to see what he would do next. She turned and ran blindly into the dark, freezing woods. Zoe spent the darkest hours of the early morning, shivering in a vinyl booth at a 24-hour neon-lit diner on the industrial outskirts of Burlington. She nursed a single, lukewarm cup of black coffee, her hand still trembling so violently she could barely lift the ceramic mug. Her clothes were caked in freezing mud, and a jagged scrape ran down her cheek from her frantic escape through the woods. But beneath the table, her mud-stained boots were planted firmly on the straps of her canvas backpack. Every time a set of headlights swept across the diner's expansive glass windows, Zoe flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew the reach of Kevin Lawson. He wasn't just a wealthy real estate developer. He was a cornerstone of the city's elite. He funded mayoral campaigns, hosted charity galas for the local police union, and played golf with judges. If she walked into a local precinct and slammed a bag of stolen cash on the desk, there was a terrifyingly high probability that the evidence would be quietly confiscated, swept under the rug, and she would be silenced before the sun went down. She needed an untouchable authority. She needed the federal government. At exactly 8 a.m., as the city was just beginning to wake, Zoe pushed through the heavy bulletproof glass doors of the FBI field office in downtown Burlington. Looking like a bruised and battered vagrant, she approached the sterile reception desk. "I need to speak to a federal agent," Zoe said, her voice raspy but unyielding. "It's regarding a multi-million-dollar bank embezzlement and a missing persons case from 1984. The receptionist blinked, looking her up and down with clear skepticism. "Miss, if you have a tip, you can fill out a form." "I don't have a tip," Zoe interrupted, hoisting the heavy canvas backpack onto the counter with a loud, authoritative thud. She unzipped the main compartment, reached inside, and pulled out a vacuum-sealed bundle of pristine, uncirculated 1981 $100 bills. She laid it on the desk, followed by the heavy, leather-bound ledger. "I have the money, and I have the confession. But you have to move right now, or the man who stole it is going to get away with the rest of it." The atmosphere in the lobby shifted from bureaucratic indifference to high-voltage urgency in a fraction of a second. Within 10 minutes, Zoe was sitting in a soundproof interrogation room beneath harsh fluorescent lights, clutching a fresh cup of coffee. Across the steel table sat Special Agent Thomas Miller, a veteran investigator from the White-Collar Crime Division. Agent Miller carefully slipped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves before opening the weathered ledger. The room was dead silent as his eyes scanned the meticulous columns of siphoned funds, falsified accounts, and the chilling notes detailing the cover-up of the missing executive. "Miss Alexandra," Agent Miller finally said, peering over the rim of his glasses, his voice deadly serious. "Do you fully comprehend what you've just brought into my office? I know it proves my stepfather Kevin Lawson is a fraud and a thief," Zoe answered, leaning forward. "And I know that right now there is another $2 million sitting inside a rusted maple sap pan at the Pine Creek RV park. He tracked me there last night. If you don't send a team immediately, he's going to load that cash into his SUV, and it will disappear forever." Agent Miller didn't ask another question. He stood up, grabbed the phone on the wall, and initiated a full-scale federal sting operation. By noon, the quiet, muddy grounds of the Pine Creek RV park were violently swarmed. A fleet of unmarked black Suburbans tore down the gravel driveway, boxing in Kevin's luxury SUV. When heavily armed federal agents breached the perimeter of Lot 14, they caught Kevin Lawson dead to rights. The arrogant, untouchable tycoon was on his hands and knees in the mud, his custom-tailored Brioni suit ruined frantically trying to stuff the remaining oilcloth bundles of 1981 currency into a set of designer duffel bags. When the agents slammed him against the side of his own vehicle to cuff him, the look of sheer, panicked disbelief on his face was absolute. His 40-year secret was over. Simultaneously, a second tactical team executed a no-knock warrant at Kevin's sprawling colonial mansion. They found Brenda Zoe's mother standing at the kitchen island. When the agents presented the warrant and explained the horrific depths of her husband's crimes, the coffee mug slipped from Brenda's hand, shattering on the granite floor. For a moment, she was frozen in shock. Then, a profound weeping relief washed over her. The invisible tyrannical cage she had lived in for a decade had just been blown wide open. The ensuing legal and media fallout was a spectacle of epic proportions. The local news channels ran the story 24/7. Kevin Lawson's real estate empire disintegrated overnight as the feds froze every asset tied to his name. The leather ledger alongside the hidden Polaroids provided an airtight, undeniable paper trail. Facing an insurmountable mountain of evidence, Kevin was denied bail and ultimately sentenced to 35 years in federal prison, virtually guaranteeing he would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. But for Zoe, the climax of the story wasn't just about watching her abuser fall. It was about the legal mechanics of her ultimate vindication. Because Zoe had purchased the dilapidated sugar shack legitimately through a county-sanctioned auction, and because she voluntarily surrendered the stolen assets to the Department of Justice, her case triggered the federal asset forfeiture and whistleblower statutes. Under the law, citizens who provide actionable intelligence leading to the recovery of stolen bank funds and criminal assets are entitled to a substantial reward. After a grueling 6-month legal process, the DOJ awarded Zoe a massive percentage of the recovered cash, supplemented by the liquidation of Kevin's illegally obtained properties. 9 months later, the freezing rain and the rusted Ford Taurus felt like a distant nightmare. Zoe Alexandra stood on the sun-drenched manicured lawn of a breathtaking historic 5-bedroom estate overlooking the sparkling waters of Lake Champlain. She held a set of heavy polished brass keys in her hands, listening to the gentle crash of the waves against her private dock. Her mother Brenda walked up beside her. They had spent the last several months in intense therapy, repairing their fractured relationship, forgiving each other, and bonding over their shared survival. Brenda wrapped a warm, steady arm around her daughter's shoulders. "It's beautiful, Zoe." Brenda smiled softly, tears pricking her eyes. "It's our home," Zoe replied, squeezing her mother's hand. They walked up the wide stone steps together, unlocking the heavy oak door. As Zoe stepped into the grand sunlit foyer of her new life, her eyes fell upon a peculiar piece of custom decor she had commissioned specifically for the entryway. Sitting under a museum-quality glass display case was a heavy, rusted 1/4-inch steel plate bisected by a jagged burnt cut mark from an angle grinder. It was an ugly, brutal piece of metal in a beautiful house. But to Zoe, it was a permanent grounding reminder. Sometimes the greatest treasures and the sharpest truths are hidden beneath layers of decay, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to cut them open. Zoe's unbelievable journey proves that sometimes our lowest moments are simply the universe setting us up for the ultimate plot twist. She turned a brutal eviction and a $10 shack into justice and a multi-million-dollar estate. If you loved this insane true crime survival story, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs a reminder to never give up, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life mysteries.